I look back now and realize that there were many ways at some of the best moments of my life I was miserable. I was not happy. I was stressed.
He stood on a Broadway stage 8 times a week, singing in a musical about a ship that everyone already knows sinks, and somewhere in the middle of that performance, night after night, Jim Parsons was still quietly terrified he'd forget his next line. Not nervous the way a newcomer might be. Not the ordinary jitters of live theater. A fear that had followed him for over 2 decades, through 4 Emmy wins, a Golden Globe, and years as the highest-paid actor on American television. That fear never once announced itself to the millions of people who watched him become one of the most recognizable faces in modern comedy. It just sat there, quietly, underneath everything. In the summer of 2026, Jim finally said out loud what he'd apparently been carrying since long before anyone knew his name. In a candid podcast conversation, he admitted that some of what looked from the outside like the best years of his life were actually years he spent unhappy, stretched thin, and convinced that everything could collapse the moment he let his guard down. He described the feeling as something like keeping dozens of plates spinning in the air simultaneously, certain that if a single one wavered, the whole structure he'd built would come crashing down with it. People around him read that intensity as professionalism, as the discipline of someone who took his craft seriously. Jim now describes it differently, closer to obsession, a compulsive need to control outcomes because some part of him never believed good things were allowed to simply happen without a fight. To understand where that fear actually came from, you have to go back further than Sheldon Cooper, further than Caltech, further than any soundstage. You have to go back to April of 2001, when Jim was 28 years old, still an unemployed actor auditioning for roles he mostly wasn't getting. That was the month his father, Milton Parsons, died in a car accident outside Houston at 52. Milton had spent his life running a plumbing company, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that keeps a family afloat. He was found by a passing driver after veering off the road alone. Jim was still 6 years away from booking the role that would define his career. Which means his father never lived to see a single episode of it. Not the pilot, not the Emmys, not the moment his son's face became one of the most familiar in the country. That loss did something to Jim's relationship with time that never fully resolved itself. Years later, on the television special Hollywood Medium, he revisited the grief on camera and was told that faster emergency care that day likely wouldn't have changed the outcome. It seemed to offer him some peace. But peace and arithmetic are different things, and the arithmetic kept running quietly in the background of his life for years. In 2018, with Big Bang Theory still one of the most watched programs on the planet, Jim turned 46 and realized, almost involuntarily, that this was exactly 6 years younger than his father had been when he died. So he did something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. He asked himself what he would do if he only had 6 years left. Would he spend one more of them playing the same character, however beloved, however lucrative? His answer was no, not because he'd stopped loving the role, but because some part of him needed to find out what else existed before his own clock ran out, whenever that might be. He brought that decision straight to executive producers Chuck Lorre and Steve Malaro, before he told the castmates he had spent 12 years standing beside on camera. Kaylee Cuoco has said the news left her so shaken she could barely breathe. Johnny Galecki later admitted he felt blindsided, less by the decision itself than by how suddenly it arrived, and has since said the whole process could have been handled with more care for the people it affected. It's a small but telling detail. Jim's father never got any say in how his own story ended. Jim, in his own quiet way, made absolutely sure that he would. Walking away from the show that made him famous didn't close the door on grief. It just meant the next round would arrive somewhere he wasn't expecting it. In 2025, Jim joined the Hulu comedy Mid-Century Modern, a series loosely inspired by the spirit of the Golden Girls, following 3 gay friends who move in together in Palm Springs. The cast included Nathan Lane, Matt Bomer, and the veteran actress Linda Lavin, who played the sharp-witted mother of Lane's character. By every account from people who worked alongside her, Lavin was adored, not in the polite, professional way colleagues often describe one another, but in a way that felt genuinely personal. On December 29, 2024, with only 3 episodes left to shoot, Lavin died suddenly at 87, following a fast-moving lung cancer diagnosis that gave almost no one time to prepare. The show's creators faced a decision no one wants to make. Recast her. Quietly write her out. Or tell the truth. Before she passed, Lavin had reportedly told the writers not to shy away from what happened to her if the worst came. So they wrote her real death into the fictional story. In her final hours, being driven to the hospital by her husband, She had reached for his hand and told him she loved him, in case it turned out to be goodbye. The writers used that exact moment in the show, spoken by her character to her television son, in an episode the creators later called one of the hardest things they've ever had to write. Hulu gave the cast and crew an extra week before filming resumed. Jim was there, acting alongside Matt Bomer, mourning a real friend while performing a version of her actual final moments, weeks after she had died, on a production schedule that didn't leave much room to simply feel any of it before the cameras started rolling again. It wasn't the first time work had asked Jim to keep performing while something enormous was happening underneath. During his final stretch on Big Bang Theory, as the show wound toward its farewell season, one of his dogs was nearing the end of his life. Jim and his husband Todd made the difficult choice to let him go peacefully at home rather than risk him dying alone at a veterinary office while Jim was on set. Just days later, while the rest of the world was gearing up for tribute specials celebrating the end of a beloved series, Jim injured himself on stage. He has since described that stretch as among the scariest few days of his life, saying it felt like standing at the edge of something genuinely dark and looking down. All of this was happening while millions of viewers tuned in weekly to laugh at Sheldon Cooper's quirks, with no idea what the man behind the character was quietly carrying. That fear of losing control, of things falling apart the instant he wasn't vigilant, didn't begin in adulthood. It started decades earlier, in a Houston suburb, where Jim grew up as the son of a plumbing company owner and a schoolteacher, performing in school plays from first grade through senior year. At one point he actually quit acting for a year, convinced it was too impractical a path, and planned to finish a business degree instead. It was watching his actor friends rehearse, along with encouragement from Todd Spiewak, then his boyfriend, that pulled him back toward the stage. The two eventually moved to Los Angeles together so Jim could pursue acting seriously, and he went on to earn a master's degree in classical theater at the University of San Diego. But underneath the ambition sat a different kind of fear entirely, one that had nothing to do with auditions or callbacks. Jim spent years terrified of being discovered as gay. Even the sight of a pride parade used to unsettle him, because he knew people around him held hostile views about exactly who he was, so he avoided gay-friendly neighborhoods altogether, choosing to blend into ordinary city blocks rather than risk being noticed. He and Todd were together for roughly 10 years before Jim came out publicly, days after a season finale aired. He has said meeting Todd was the real reason he finally had that conversation with his family, because Todd mattered too much to keep hidden any longer. Jim was terrified the announcement would damage his career, maybe even cost him the show, at a time when leading men on major network sitcoms rarely came out at all, especially ones playing characters beloved by a broad and not always progressive audience. Instead, he has said becoming part of a community that still faces open hostility gave him a strength he never expected, and if anything, it helped his career rather than hurting it. He and Todd married in 2017 after roughly 15 years together, and Jim has described their life since as almost deliberately unremarkable, full of the same routines as anyone else's marriage. Every reflection Jim has offered in 2026 seems to circle back to the same idea: time, and how little of it any of us are guaranteed. He said there's no amount of money that could convince him to return to the version of himself that existed during Big Bang Theory's biggest years, the version constantly overworking, constantly bracing for failure. He's called it a self-tortured stretch of his life, one that taught him something, but not something he'd choose to relive. That's a strange sentence to hear from a man who reached the kind of success most actors spend their whole careers chasing and never find. Before Big Bang Theory, he auditioned for roughly 30 different roles, watching pilot after pilot get rejected once he'd actually booked the part. He even auditioned for the American version of The Office, a show he privately assumed was a bad idea, a British import no one here would want. He was wrong about that, spectacularly. This year, at the Tony Awards, Jim showed up without any of the styling people associate with his current Broadway run in Titanic and admitted something few expected from him. He sometimes worries fans who remember him as Sheldon will be disappointed by how much older he looks now. He started that role at 34. He's 53 now, 1 year older than his father ever got to be. When a podcast host pointed that out to him directly, Jim didn't flinch. He called it bonus time, not as a throwaway line, but as something closer to a belief he's built the rest of his life around. In a strange and almost unbearable coincidence, that same July, as his most honest interview in years was spreading across the internet, a false report claiming Jim had died went viral, gathering close to 1 million reactions before his representatives had to step in and confirm he was alive. For a few days, people online were genuinely mourning a man who was, at that very moment, quietly telling the world the opposite, that he finally understood how limited his time actually was, and that he intended to spend what remained of it differently. He no longer has anything left to prove. He wants to do work that brings him joy, because nobody, he said, actually knows how much time they have left. And still, even now, decades into performing, he walks into every show fighting the same old fear of blanking on his lines, a nervousness that never seems to fully leave, no matter how experienced he becomes. The tragedy was never really the sitcom ending, or the trophies, or the fame that followed him everywhere he went. It was a man who spent decades treating survival like a countdown clock, calculating loss before it arrived, bracing for an ending that hadn't come yet, right up until he finally decided to stop running from it and start living inside whatever time he actually had left. Maybe that's the part of his story worth sitting with longest, not the awards or the headlines, but the quiet human decision to stop waiting for the plates to fall and simply be present for the life that's still, against every fear he carried, still his to live.